The words hit Layla like ice water. She stood frozen behind the counter of Meridian Bistro, her name tag suddenly feeling like a target on her chest. The man in the $3,000 suit had just finished destroying her in Arabic, assuming the typical American waitress couldn't possibly understand. His smug smile said everything. "You're beneath me. You're invisible. You're nothing." But he'd made one fatal mistake. Layla's fingers tightened around her order pad as she processed every cutting word he'd spoken about her appearance, her intelligence, her worth. The dining room felt electric with tension. Other customers sensed something brewing. The man's business partners shifted uncomfortably. When Layla looked up, her eyes held a darkness that made him freeze mid-laugh. In perfect crystalline Arabic, she began to speak, and with each word, his world started crumbling. The lunch rush at Meridian Bistro moved like clockwork, each server weaving between marble-top tables where Manhattan's elite conducted business over $30 salads. Layla Ahmed balanced 3 plates on her left arm, while her right hand steadied the 4th, her movements precise despite the weight. 6 months of serving the city's most demanding clientele had taught her that perfection wasn't just expected. It was survival. The bistro's floor-to-ceiling windows caught the October sunlight, casting geometric shadows across the polished concrete floors where every footstep echoed with purpose. She could feel the familiar weight of judgment in the room, that subtle assessment that happened whenever she approached a new table, her olive complexion and name tag marking her as different in this temple of old money and newer fortunes. Table 12 sat 3 men in suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent, their conversation flowing between English and Arabic as they discussed what sounded like a major acquisition. Layla had served enough power lunches to recognize the signs, the expensive watches, the way they never looked directly at service staff, the assumption that their words existed in a bubble of privilege that the help couldn't penetrate. The man facing her wore confidence like armor, his salt and pepper beard meticulously groomed, his wedding ring catching light as he gestured emphatically. Hassan al-Rashid, according to the reservation list she'd memorized that morning. A name that had triggered something familiar in the back of her mind, though she couldn't place why. As Layla approached with their appetizers, Hassan's voice carried clearly in Arabic, his tone sharp with irritation as he criticized the restaurant's service speed. His companions nodded along, one checking his Rolex, while the other glanced dismissively at the servers moving past their table. The language flowed around her like a current she wasn't supposed to understand, creating an invisible barrier that made her simultaneously hyper-aware and completely ignored. She'd grown accustomed to this phenomenon, how certain customers spoke freely in front of her as if she were furniture, their assumptions about her background, education, and intelligence written in their casual disregard. "Excuse me," Hassan said in accented English as she set down his plate, his eyes never quite meeting hers. "This isn't what I ordered. I specifically requested the salmon, not this." His finger jabbed toward the perfectly prepared sea bass, his voice carrying the particular edge of someone unaccustomed to being contradicted. Layla glanced at her order pad, knowing with absolute certainty that he'd ordered the sea bass, but also knowing that pointing this out would only escalate his displeasure. The customer was always right, even when they were demonstrably wrong, especially when they had the power to complain to management and potentially cost her the job that barely covered her studio apartment's rent. "Of course, sir. I'll have the kitchen prepare the salmon right away," she replied, her voice maintaining the perfect balance of apology and professionalism that had become second nature. As she reached for his plate, Hassan switched back to Arabic, his words flowing to his companions with casual cruelty that made her hands pause for just a fraction of a second. He was commenting on her appearance, her obvious lack of intelligence, how American service workers were clearly hired for compliance rather than competence. The familiar sting of casual prejudice settled in her chest, but she maintained her composed expression, years of practice allowing her to absorb the blow without flinching visibly. The conversation continued as she cleared their appetizer plates, Hassan's voice growing more animated as he warmed to his theme. He spoke about the decline of service standards, the entitlement of younger workers, The way immigrants came to America and expected everything handed to them without understanding how real business worked. His companions laughed at appropriate moments, their own comfort with casual cruelty evident in their easy participation. Layla moved through her tasks methodically, refilling water glasses and ensuring their breadbasket remained full, all while absorbing every word of their discussion about a major technology contract that would determine their company's future direction. When she returned with Hassan's salmon, prepared exactly to his earlier specifications that he'd now conveniently forgotten, he barely glanced up from his conversation. The discussion had shifted to more personal territory. Hassan was describing his weekend at the Hamptons, the incompetence of his household staff, his wife's shopping habits that required constant correction. His voice carried the particular satisfaction of someone who enjoyed asserting dominance, even over people who weren't present to defend themselves. The power dynamics at the table were clear. Hassan spoke, the others listened and affirmed, and everyone understood their place in the hierarchy he'd constructed. As the meal progressed, Layla found herself cataloging details with unconscious precision. The way Hassan checked his phone constantly, the nervous energy of the younger executive to his left, the older man's careful neutrality that suggested he was evaluating more than just the business proposal being discussed. Their conversation revealed fragments of information: Zenith Technologies, a major client presentation scheduled for next week, concerns about cultural sensitivity in their international expansion plans. Hassan dismissed these concerns with a wave of his hand, insisting that business was business regardless of local customs or sensibilities. The afternoon crowd began to thin as the lunch rush ended, but Table 12 remained deep in conversation, their voices growing more careless as the restaurant emptied around them. Hassan's critique of American work ethic expanded to include specific observations about their current server, how she clearly lacked the sophistication to understand proper service, how her obvious immigrant background made her grateful for any job she could get. His words carved through the air with practiced ease, each phrase designed to diminish and dismiss, confident in the barrier of language that made his cruelty invisible to its target. Layla's grip on her order pad had gradually tightened throughout the meal, her knuckles now white against the black leather cover as Hassan's commentary grew increasingly personal and cutting. The familiar sensation of being simultaneously present and erased filled the space around Table 12, where three men conducted business while casually dehumanizing the woman serving their expensive meal. The weight of their assumptions pressed against her professional composure, each dismissive glance and condescending gesture adding to a pressure that had been building for months in this job, years in this industry, a lifetime of moments where people looked through her rather than at her. The moment arrived with shocking suddenness. Hassan, emboldened by wine and the perceived privacy of his native language, turned his attention directly to her appearance as she approached to clear their main course plates. His words were surgical in their precision, commenting on her obvious attempts to appear presentable despite her clearly limited budget for proper clothing, her naive belief that hard work alone could elevate someone from her obvious station in life. The restaurant's ambient noise seemed to fade as his voice carried clearly across the nearly empty dining room, his companion nodding along with the casual acceptance of men accustomed to such casual cruelty. When Layla looked up from the plates she was stacking, her dark eyes met Hassan's with an intensity that made his next words die in his throat. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Something had shifted in her expression, a hardness that hadn't been there moments before. Her fingers, still white-knuckled around her order pad, began to tremble slightly, but not with fear or humiliation. The tremor spoke of barely contained energy, of something powerful being held in check by the thinnest margin of professional restraint. The dining room felt suddenly electric, as if a storm had gathered overhead without anyone noticing the changing pressure in the air. The silence that followed Hassan's final insult stretched like a held breath, the restaurant's ambient sounds fading until only the soft clink of silverware and distant kitchen noise remained. Layla set down the plates she'd been holding with deliberate care, her movements precise and controlled despite the storm building behind her dark eyes. Hassan's smug expression faltered slightly as something in her posture shifted, an almost imperceptible straightening that suggested hidden depths beneath the subservient exterior he'd been so confidently dismissing. His companions continued their conversation in lowered voices, unaware that the dynamic at their table was about to undergo a seismic shift that would leave none of them unchanged. When Layla spoke, her voice carried across the dining room with crystalline clarity, each Arabic word pronounced with the precision of someone who had learned the language not in classrooms, but at family tables, in heated discussions, in moments of joy and frustration where only her mother tongue could capture the full weight of emotion. "Perhaps," she said, her eyes never leaving Hassan's increasingly pale face, "you should be more careful about who you assume can't understand your rather limited vocabulary." The words landed like physical blows, each syllable perfectly enunciated, carrying not just fluency but the subtle regional accent that marked her as someone who understood not just the language but its cultural nuances and social implications. Hassan's fork clattered against his plate as his hand involuntarily jerked, wine spreading across the pristine white tablecloth like spilled blood. His mouth opened and closed silently, the confidence that had carried him through decades of business meetings and social dominance evaporating in the face of this impossible reversal. Around them, other diners began to take notice, conversation slowing as the tension at table 12 became impossible to ignore. The younger executive shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier laughter now seeming cruel and misguided, while the older man leaned back slightly, his experienced eyes taking in the changed dynamics with the careful attention of someone who recognized when power balances were about to shift dramatically. "You spoke about my intelligence," Layla continued in Arabic, her professional mask slipping to reveal something far more dangerous beneath. "My appearance, my obvious poverty, my immigrant desperation for any work I could find." Each phrase she quoted back to him was delivered with the kind of precision that comes from total recall, proving that every word of his lengthy critique had been heard, understood, and catalogued. The restaurant's soft jazz soundtrack seemed suddenly inappropriate, too gentle for the surgical dismantling taking place at table 12, where a woman in a server's apron was methodically destroying a man who had built his sense of superiority on the assumption that his cruelty was invisible to its target. Hassan's face had progressed through several shades of red, his earlier confidence replaced by a growing panic as he realized the full scope of his miscalculation. There's been a misunderstanding," he stammered in English, his accent thicker now, under stress, reaching for the familiar armor of corporate speak that had protected him in countless previous situations. But Layla wasn't interested in allowing him the comfort of switching languages or controlling the conversation's direction. She continued in Arabic, her voice growing stronger with each word, drawing on years of suppressed frustration and professional indignity that had finally found their target in this man who had revealed himself so completely. "You told your colleagues that American service workers lack sophistication," she said, stepping closer to their table, her voice carrying clearly to nearby diners who were now openly watching the confrontation unfold. "You suggested that people like me should be grateful for any opportunity, regardless of how we're treated. You made very specific comments about my intelligence, my background, my worth as a human being." Her words were surgical in their precision, each one carefully chosen to maximize impact, while maintaining the iron control that had kept her employed in an industry that demanded constant emotional suppression from its workers. The maitre d' appeared at the edge of the dining room, his practiced eye immediately assessing the situation and recognizing that this was not a standard customer service issue. He approached their table with the careful steps of someone who understood that whatever was happening here had moved beyond his usual realm of complaint resolution and discount offerings. Hassan looked toward him desperately, seeking rescue from an interaction that had spiraled completely beyond his control. But the man's expression was carefully neutral, waiting to understand the full situation before taking sides in what was clearly a more complex situation than it appeared on the surface. "The remarkable thing," Layla continued, switching back to English for the benefit of the growing audience, "is how comfortable you were saying these things, how natural it seemed to discuss my obvious limitations and your superior position." Her professional composure remained intact, but there was steel beneath the courtesy now, a strength that transformed her from the invisible service worker Hassan had dismissed into someone who commanded attention and respect. The other servers had stopped their tasks, sensing that something significant was happening, though they couldn't quite understand the full scope of the drama unfolding before them. Hassan's business partners were now shifting uncomfortably. Their earlier enjoyment of his casual cruelty transformed into embarrassment as they realized they had been complicit in something that was being exposed in front of an increasingly interested audience. The younger man pulled out his phone, perhaps calculating how this incident might affect their afternoon meetings, while the older executive's expression grew increasingly grave as he recognized that their companion's character was being revealed in ways that would have lasting professional implications. The carefully constructed image of sophisticated business leaders conducting important deals was crumbling under the weight of casual bigotry exposed to public scrutiny. "I think," Layla said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had finally found her moment to speak truth to power, "you owe everyone at this table an apology. Not just for your assumptions about me, but for the casual way you've revealed your character to your colleagues." She gestured slightly toward his increasingly uncomfortable companions, who were now faced with the uncomfortable reality of their earlier complicity in behavior they could no longer pretend to ignore. The restaurant's other patrons were no longer even pretending not to watch, the drama at Table 12 having become the afternoon's unexpected entertainment. Hassan's face was now a mottled combination of embarrassment and rage, his carefully constructed professional persona cracking under pressure that he'd never experienced in his corporate world where hierarchy and cultural assumptions protected him from consequences. He fumbled for his wallet, throwing cash onto the table with shaking hands, clearly desperate to escape a situation that had moved far beyond his ability to control or understand. This is completely inappropriate," he managed to stammer, his voice lacking any of its earlier authority, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears as he struggled to reassert dominance in a situation where he had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. As Hassan rose abruptly from his chair, his business card fell from his jacket pocket, landing face up on the wine-stained tablecloth where his corporate title and contact information were clearly visible to anyone who cared to look. The small plastic rectangle seemed to mock his hasty retreat, a tangible reminder of the professional identity that had just been tarnished by his own words and assumptions. Layla glanced down at the card, her expression unreadable, before looking back up at Hassan with eyes that promised this encounter was far from over, though he was too rattled to recognize the warning in her gaze. The business card lay on Layla's kitchen counter like evidence from a crime scene, its embossed letters catching light from her apartment's single overhead fixture as she researched Hassan al-Rashid's digital footprint late into the evening. Her laptop screen illuminated the cramped studio space she called home, where financial necessity had stripped away any pretense of luxury, leaving only the essentials arranged with careful efficiency. Zenith Technologies emerged from her searches as a mid-sized firm specializing in international consulting and technology implementation. Hassan's position as vice president of operations giving him significant influence over contracts worth millions of dollars annually. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was conducting this investigation from a fold-out table in a space barely larger than Hassan's corner office, using skills that her current employment situation had rendered invisible to everyone around her. LinkedIn revealed Hassan's professional trajectory with clinical precision: MBA from a respectable program, steady advancement through various consulting firms, a reputation built on aggressive expansion into emerging markets where cultural sensitivity was often sacrificed for profit margins. His company profile photo showed the same arrogant smile she'd seen at lunch, the confident expression of someone who had never faced serious professional consequences for his personal prejudices. As she scrolled through his connections and endorsements, a pattern emerged of associates who shared similar backgrounds and perspectives, a professional echo chamber that had likely reinforced his casual bigotry for decades without challenge or consequence. The deeper she dug into Zenith Technologies' client list and recent projects, the more familiar certain details became, triggering memories she'd tried to bury after her startup's spectacular failure 18 months earlier. Her own company, Cultural Bridge Solutions, had been developing software to help international firms navigate cultural sensitivities in emerging markets. exactly the kind of work Zenith now dominated. The funding meeting that had gone so wrong, the last-minute client withdrawal that had destroyed her business plan, the investor who had suddenly developed cold feet after initially committing to her seed round. Pieces of a puzzle she'd never fully understood began clicking into place with sickening clarity. She pulled out her old business files from the banker's box tucked beneath her bed. Documents she'd kept meaning to throw away, but hadn't quite been able to discard completely. The timeline was all there in her meticulous notes. The initial interest from Sterling Ventures, Marcus Sterling's enthusiasm for her cultural competency platform, the scheduled final presentation where everything had fallen apart without explanation. Zenith Technologies had signed a contract with Sterling Ventures for similar services just 3 weeks after her company's collapse, a coincidence that now seemed far more sinister in light of Hassan's character revelation at the restaurant. Her Wharton MBA hung in its simple frame above her desk, a reminder of capabilities that her current situation had rendered temporarily invisible to the world. The degree had cost her 6 figures in debt that she was still paying off through her restaurant wages, but it had also provided her with the analytical tools to recognize patterns that others might miss. Hassan's involvement in her business failure might have been indirect, but his company's timing and market positioning suggested someone had inside information about her clients and competitive strategies. The casual cruelty he displayed at lunch was likely just the surface expression of professional practices that destroyed competitors without ever engaging in direct confrontation. She reached out to her former business school network, carefully crafted messages to classmates who had moved into venture capital and consulting roles throughout the city. The responses came slowly over the next few days. Alumni connections, sharing information with the careful discretion of professionals who understood that reputation was everything in their interconnected world. Marcus Sterling's name appeared repeatedly in conversations about ethical business practices and cultural sensitivity initiatives. His reputation for thorough vetting of potential partners apparently genuine rather than merely performative. Several contacts confirmed that Zenith Technologies had a concerning track record with diversity and inclusion, though nothing ever rose to the level of legal action or public scandal. Her research revealed that Hassan's pattern of dismissive behavior wasn't limited to restaurant interactions. Former Zenith employees reached through professional networks and carefully worded inquiries, painted a picture of systematic microaggressions and cultural insensitivity that created hostile work environments for anyone who didn't fit the company's narrow demographic profile. 3 separate individuals, contacted through discreet intermediaries, described incidents where Hassan's casual bigotry had created uncomfortable situations during client meetings, though none had felt empowered to formally complain, given his position and the company's apparent tolerance for such behavior. The security footage from Meridian Bistro proved easier to obtain than she'd expected, the restaurant's owner agreeing to provide a copy after she explained the situation and demonstrated her fluency in Arabic. The recording captured Hassan's entire lunch conversation in clear audio, his words providing undeniable evidence of the casual cruelty that had characterized his discussion with colleagues. More importantly for her purposes, the footage also captured his business associates' reactions, their discomfort becoming more apparent with each replaying of his dismissive commentary about service workers and immigrants. As she transcribed the most damaging portions of Hassan's recorded statements, Layla found herself drawing on translation skills that had been developed over years of bridging cultural gaps for family members and community organizations. The precision required to capture not just his words, but their cultural implications, the subtle ways his language revealed assumptions about superiority and entitlement, provided her with ammunition that could devastate his professional reputation if properly deployed. His casual use of terms that carried deeper meaning in Arabic, expressions that revealed ingrained prejudices about social hierarchy and cultural worth, would be particularly damaging when presented to potential clients focused on international cultural sensitivity. She spent hours crafting a comprehensive analysis of Hassan's comments, contextualizing them within broader patterns of workplace discrimination and cultural insensitivity that violated numerous corporate ethics guidelines. The document grew into a detailed presentation that could serve multiple purposes: evidence for potential legal action, material for corporate diversity training, or leverage in business negotiations where cultural competency was valued. Her business school training in strategic communication served her well as she shaped the narrative to emphasize not just Hassan's personal failings, but their potential impact on any organization that chose to work with him. The breakthrough came when she discovered that Sterling Ventures had recently announced a major initiative focused on supporting minority-owned businesses and promoting cultural diversity in their investment portfolio. Marcus Sterling himself had given several interviews about the importance of partnering with firms that shared their values, explicitly mentioning concerns about working with organizations that demonstrated bias against marginalized communities. Hassan's recorded comments would be particularly damaging in light of Sterling's public commitments, especially since Zenith Technologies was reportedly competing for a major contract expansion that would significantly increase their influence within Sterling's network. Her apartment felt different now, transformed from a symbol of reduced circumstances into a war room where she could plan her next moves with strategic precision. The fold-out table that had seemed pathetic now served as command central for an operation that would require all her skills in business strategy, cultural analysis, and professional networking. She'd spent 18 months serving other people's meals and absorbing their casual cruelty. But that experience had taught her things about human nature and power dynamics that no business school could provide. Hassan had revealed his true character at lunch, and now she intended to ensure that revelation had appropriate consequences for both his career and his company's reputation. The final piece of her research involved understanding exactly how deeply Hassan's prejudices had infected Zenith Technologies' corporate culture and client relationships. If his behavior at the restaurant was representative of his professional conduct, there would be other victims. Other instances where his assumptions about cultural superiority had damaged relationships or created liability for his firm. She began reaching out to former clients and competitors, carefully constructed inquiries designed to uncover patterns of behavior that could demonstrate systematic rather than isolated problems within Hassan's sphere of influence. The Sterling Ventures building rose 43 floors into the Manhattan sky, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun as Layla stepped from the subway into the bustling energy of the financial district. She'd traded her server's apron for a carefully chosen navy blazer and professional dress that suggested competence without ostentation, her appearance now aligned with the strategic consulting persona she was about to present. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor gave her time to review her presentation materials one final time, each slide crafted to demonstrate expertise, while subtly raising concerns about cultural competency in international business ventures. Her reflection in the polished steel doors showed someone who belonged in these corporate spaces, the invisible waitress from Meridian Bistro, replaced by the MBA graduate and former entrepreneur who had always existed beneath the surface. Marcus Sterling's office overlooked the Hudson River, its floor-to-ceiling windows framing a view that spoke of success measured in decades rather than quarters, while the carefully curated artwork and international artifacts suggested someone who valued global perspectives and cultural understanding. He rose from behind his desk as she entered, his handshake firm and his attention immediately focused in the way that separated truly successful executives from those who merely played the part. Their initial conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of shared professional language, his questions probing and intelligent as he assessed not just her presentation but her understanding of the complexities involved in cross-cultural business development. Cultural Bridge Solutions was ahead of its time, Sterling said after reviewing her portfolio of work from her failed startup, his tone carrying genuine respect rather than the polite dismissiveness she'd grown accustomed to receiving. The market wasn't ready for that level of sophistication in cultural competency analysis. But given recent global events and changing consumer expectations, I think the timing might be perfect now. His words carried the weight of someone who understood that business success increasingly required genuine cultural understanding rather than superficial diversity initiatives. A perspective that aligned perfectly with the strategic positioning she'd prepared. As their conversation deepened, Layla began weaving subtle concerns about cultural sensitivity into their discussion of potential partnership opportunities. Her approach calibrated to raise questions without appearing to target any specific organization or individual. I've noticed that many consulting firms talk about cultural competency but lack the deep understanding necessary to avoid potentially damaging incidents, she said, her tone professional but carrying undertones of experience with such failures. Clients are becoming increasingly sophisticated in their ability to distinguish between genuine cultural expertise and superficial compliance with diversity requirements. Sterling's interest was clearly piqued by her insights, his follow-up questions probing deeper into specific examples of cultural miscommunication in business settings and their potential impact on long-term client relationships. She found herself drawing on her restaurant experience in unexpected ways, translating observations about how different cultural groups interacted in social settings into broader principles about professional relationship building and trust development. The very experiences that Hassan had dismissed as evidence of her limited sophistication were now serving as valuable data points in a strategic consultation that could reshape important business relationships. The conversation was interrupted by Sterling's assistant announcing an unexpected arrival. Hassan al-Rashid was here for their scheduled quarterly review meeting, apparently having moved up his appointment without proper notification. The irony was almost too perfect to believe, though Layla maintained her professional composure as Sterling apologized for the scheduling conflict and suggested they continue their discussion after his existing commitment. She gathered her materials with deliberate calm, her mind already calculating how to leverage this unexpected opportunity to observe Hassan in his professional environment. "Actually," she said, inspiration striking as she prepared to leave, "if it wouldn't be inappropriate, I'd be interested in observing part of your meeting. Cultural competency consulting often requires understanding how different personality types and communication styles interact in business settings. It might provide valuable context for our potential collaboration." Sterling considered her request for a moment before agreeing, his decision likely influenced by the substantial consulting fees they'd been discussing and his genuine interest in her analytical approach to cultural dynamics. Hassan entered Sterling's office with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being welcomed in expensive spaces, his earlier restaurant humiliation apparently forgotten or compartmentalized in the way that successful executives learn to manage setbacks. His expression shifted subtly when he recognized Layla, confusion flickering across his features as he tried to place her in this unexpected context. Clearly struggling to reconcile the server from Meridian Bistro with the professional consultant sitting in Marcus Sterling's office. The moment stretched uncomfortably as he attempted to process this impossible transformation while maintaining his composure in front of his most important client. "Hassan, I'd like you to meet Layla Ahmed, a cultural competency consultant we're considering for our international expansion initiatives," Sterling said, his introduction seamlessly professional while creating a dynamic that left Hassan with no choice but to acknowledge her as an equal in this setting. The forced politeness that followed was excruciating to witness, Hassan's barely controlled panic evident in the way his hand trembled slightly during their handshake, his usual corporate confidence undermined by the impossible presence of someone who had seen him at his worst just days earlier. Their business discussion proceeded with Hassan clearly off balance, his presentations lacking their usual polish as he struggled to concentrate while Layla took notes with the focused attention of someone evaluating his professional competence. She asked pointed questions about Zenith Technologies' approach to cultural sensitivity in their international projects, her inquiries professionally phrased but carrying implications that made Hassan's discomfort increasingly obvious to Sterling. The power dynamics she'd studied in academic settings were playing out in real time, her strategic questioning exposing gaps in Hassan's knowledge while demonstrating her own expertise. "I'm particularly interested in how you handle situations where cultural miscommunication might damage client relationships," she said, her tone innocuously professional while her eyes met Hassan's with unmistakable meaning. "Have you encountered instances where assumptions about cultural backgrounds led to inappropriate interactions or damaged business outcomes?" The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by silk thread, its implications clear to Hassan while remaining perfectly reasonable to Sterling, who nodded approvingly at what seemed like sophisticated strategic thinking. Hassan's responses became increasingly defensive and less coherent as the meeting progressed, his usual confidence replaced by the fumbling uncertainty of someone who recognized that he was being systematically dismantled by an opponent he'd seriously underestimated. Sterling's expression grew more concerned with each awkward exchange, his experienced eye clearly registering that his trusted contractor was performing far below his usual standards. The cultural competency issues that Layla had raised theoretically were now being demonstrated practically through Hassan's own deteriorating performance under pressure. As the meeting concluded, Sterling's body language suggested growing concerns about his business relationship with Zenith Technologies, though he maintained professional courtesy throughout the concluding pleasantries. Hassan departed with uncharacteristic haste, his usual confident farewell replaced by mumbled excuses about urgent matters requiring his attention. The contrast between his entrance and exit was so stark that Sterling immediately turned to Layla with questions about what she'd observed, his business instincts clearly triggered by Hassan's unusual behavior and defensive responses. Cultural stress responses can reveal a lot about someone's underlying attitudes and competencies, Layla observed, her tone carefully analytical rather than accusatory, allowing Sterling to draw his own conclusions about what they'd witnessed. The seeds of doubt about Hassan's professional capabilities had been planted with surgical precision, her strategic questioning having exposed weaknesses that might otherwise have remained hidden beneath his corporate persona. The afternoon had demonstrated that her business school training and real-world experience could be combined into a formidable strategic weapon when properly deployed against targets who underestimated her capabilities and resolve. The call from Marcus Sterling came 3 days after their interrupted meeting, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had been conducting discreet inquiries and didn't entirely like what he'd discovered. Layla accepted his invitation for a private lunch at his club, an exclusive institution where membership required not just wealth but the kind of social connections that opened doors throughout the financial world. The dining room's subdued elegance, with its dark wood paneling and portraits of deceased magnates, provided the perfect setting for the kind of conversation that could reshape business relationships and professional reputations with surgical precision. Sterling's choice of venue sent a clear message about the seriousness of their discussion and his own commitment to understanding the full scope of what he'd witnessed during Hassan's unusual performance. "I've been thinking about your observations regarding cultural competency and stress responses," Sterling began after they'd ordered, his words carefully chosen to avoid direct accusations while inviting her to elaborate on concerns he was clearly developing independently. "Hassan's behavior during our meeting was unusual. He's typically much more composed and articulate when presenting to our team. His tone suggested that he'd already begun connecting dots that didn't paint a flattering picture of his longtime business associate, though his corporate instincts demanded verification before taking any decisive action that could impact significant financial commitments." Layla reached into her briefcase and withdrew a tablet containing the restaurant's security footage, her movements deliberate as she prepared to reveal evidence that would fundamentally alter Sterling's perception of Hassan's character and professional judgment. "I think you should see something that might explain his behavior," she said, her voice steady despite the significance of what she was about to share. "This was recorded at Meridian Bistro 3 days before our meeting. The conversation is in Arabic, but I can provide translation." The tablet's screen reflected the restaurant's elegant interior as she cued the footage to Hassan's most damaging statements, her finger hovering over the play button while Sterling leaned forward with growing concern. The audio quality was remarkably clear, Hassan's voice carrying easily across the restaurant's acoustics as he delivered his casual destruction of Layla's character and worth in what he'd assumed was a private language barrier. Sterling's expression grew progressively darker as she translated each cutting phrase, his business instincts immediately recognizing the legal and reputational liability that such attitudes represented for any organization. "He's talking about me," Layla explained quietly, "commenting on my appearance, my intelligence, my obvious desperation for employment, my immigrant background." This continued for approximately 20 minutes before I responded. The clinical precision of her translation made Hassan's cruelty even more stark, stripping away any possibility that his words could be dismissed as cultural misunderstanding or momentary poor judgment. Sterling watched the footage twice more, his trained eye cataloging details that would have legal implications for any business relationship that continued beyond this conversation. This represents a pattern of thinking that we simply cannot tolerate in our business relationships, he said finally, his tone carrying the finality of someone who had built his reputation on making difficult decisions quickly when presented with clear evidence. Our commitment to diversity and inclusion isn't just policy. It's fundamental to how we operate and who we choose to associate with professionally. His words carried weight beyond their immediate context, suggesting that Hassan's recorded statements had violated principles that Sterling considered non-negotiable in his business dealings. The conversation that followed revealed the scope of Sterling's growing concerns about Zenith Technologies and Hassan's leadership role within the organization. Doubts that had apparently been building for months before their recent meeting brought them into sharp focus. Several other clients had raised questions about cultural sensitivity in Zenith's international operations, complaints that had seemed minor individually, but formed a troubling pattern when considered collectively. We've had 3 separate incidents in the past year where Hassan's cultural assumptions created uncomfortable situations during client presentations, Sterling admitted, his tone suggesting that he was finally connecting dots that should have been obvious earlier. Layla's research into Hassan's background had uncovered additional evidence of problematic patterns, information she now shared with the careful precision of someone who understood that reputation destruction required factual accuracy rather than emotional accusations. Former employees had described a workplace culture where casual bigotry was tolerated as long as it didn't create legal liability, while competitors had noted Hassan's tendency to make culturally insensitive assumptions during industry conferences and networking events. The pattern that emerged suggested someone whose prejudices had become so ingrained that he no longer recognized their impact on his professional effectiveness or ethical judgment. "There's something else you should know," Layla said, producing documentation of her research into Zenith's role in her startup's failure 18 months earlier. The timeline she'd constructed revealed a pattern of competitive intelligence gathering and strategic interference that suggested Hassan's company had used insider information to undermine her business relationships while positioning themselves as the preferred alternative. Sterling's examination of her evidence revealed connections that painted Zenith's business practices in an increasingly unflattering light. Their success apparently built partly on systematically destroying competitors through means that violated both ethical standards and potentially legal boundaries. The implications for Sterling Ventures were immediately clear. Their association with Zenith Technologies represented not just reputational risk, but potential legal liability if Hassan's pattern of discriminatory behavior created problems for their clients or portfolio companies. "We can't continue a business relationship with someone whose personal prejudices represent this level of risk to our operations and reputation," Sterling concluded, his tone carrying the weight of a decision that would have immediate financial consequences for both organizations. "More importantly, we can't in good conscience continue enabling behavior that causes real harm to people who deserve better treatment." As their lunch continued, Sterling's questions revealed the depth of his commitment to understanding not just Hassan's individual failings, but the systematic problems they represented within Zenith's corporate culture. Her analysis of workplace dynamics and cultural competency provided him with frameworks for evaluating other business relationships and identifying similar patterns before they created larger problems. "Your insights about cultural stress responses were particularly valuable," he acknowledged. "Not just for identifying problems, but for understanding how to prevent them through better vetting and relationship management." The conversation concluded with Sterling's commitment to conducting a comprehensive review of Zenith Technologies' practices and Hassan's specific role in problematic incidents, a process that would likely result in the termination of contracts worth millions of dollars annually. "We'll need to document everything carefully and provide Hassan with an opportunity to respond to these concerns," he said, though his tone suggested that the outcome was already determined by the weight of evidence they'd reviewed. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of behavior that fundamentally conflicts with our values and business practices." Layla left the club with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully transformed personal injustice into systematic accountability. Though she recognized that Hassan's response to losing his most important client relationship would likely involve desperate attempts to discredit her credibility and professional reputation. The evidence she'd gathered was comprehensive enough to withstand scrutiny, but she also understood that cornered individuals with significant resources often resorted to increasingly destructive tactics when their survival was threatened. The next phase of this confrontation would require even greater strategic precision, as Hassan realized the full scope of what he was losing and why. Sterling's parting words had contained both warning and encouragement. Hassan would likely attempt to retaliate against her personally and professionally, but Sterling's organization would provide support and protection for someone who had demonstrated such valuable insights into cultural competency and business ethics. People who speak truth to power always face consequences, he'd observed, but they also create opportunities for positive change that benefit everyone in the long run. The weight of that responsibility settled over her as she returned to her apartment, knowing that the comfortable anonymity of her service job was ending and a much more visible and vulnerable phase of her career was about to begin. Hassan's retaliation came with the swift brutality of someone whose carefully constructed professional world was collapsing around him. His desperate counterattack revealing the full scope of resources he was willing to deploy to destroy anyone who threatened his position. The emails began arriving at Sterling Ventures within hours of their contract termination meeting. Hassan's legal team flooding Sterling's organization with allegations that painted Layla as a corporate spy engaged in industrial espionage and personal vendetta rather than legitimate business consulting. His strategy was sophisticated and vicious, using her startup's failure and subsequent employment in the service industry as evidence of unstable character and vindictive motivations that made her accusations unreliable and potentially fraudulent. The accusations were carefully crafted to exploit common prejudices about failed entrepreneurs and service workers, suggesting that someone who had fallen from MBA graduate to restaurant server was clearly unstable and possibly desperate enough to fabricate evidence for financial gain. Hassan's lawyers had constructed a narrative that portrayed her cultural competency consulting as a thin cover for revenge-motivated character assassination, while her fluency in Arabic became suspicious rather than valuable, suggesting possible connections to industrial espionage networks rather than legitimate multicultural expertise. The speed and sophistication of his response demonstrated resources that could overwhelm most individuals, legal and PR machinery designed to destroy reputations before victims could mount effective defenses. Sterling's initial reaction to Hassan's counterattack was predictably cautious, his business instincts demanding verification of facts when faced with serious allegations that could impact his organization's liability and reputation. The carefully constructed case against Layla was designed to exploit exactly this kind of corporate risk aversion, using legal threats and character assassination to create enough doubt that reasonable people would distance themselves rather than risk association with potential scandal. "We need to investigate these claims thoroughly," Sterling told her during an emergency meeting, his tone apologetic but firm. "Not because I doubt your credibility, but because Hassan's allegations require careful response to protect everyone involved." The forensic investigation into her background and motivations consumed several tense weeks, professional investigators examining every aspect of her claims, while Hassan's team continued their systematic campaign to destroy her reputation throughout their shared professional networks. Her former business school classmates began receiving calls asking about her character and stability, while restaurant industry contacts were questioned about her employment history and possible motivations for targeting successful customers. The investigation's scope revealed Hassan's willingness to spend significant resources on character destruction, suggesting that he viewed her threat to his career as existential rather than merely inconvenient. Layla's salvation came from an unexpected source. Hassan's assistant, Maria Santos, who had witnessed years of discriminatory behavior and inappropriate comments but lacked the professional security to speak out until Hassan's desperation created an opportunity for justice. Maria's documentation was comprehensive and damning, including recorded phone calls where Hassan made explicitly prejudiced statements about employees and clients, email correspondence that revealed systematic bias in hiring and promotion decisions, and meeting notes that captured his casual cruelty toward anyone he perceived as inferior. Her evidence painted a picture of workplace harassment that extended far beyond his restaurant behavior, demonstrating patterns that validated every accusation Layla had made while providing independent corroboration that destroyed Hassan's credibility. The financial irregularities that Maria revealed were even more devastating than his discriminatory behavior, demonstrating a pattern of embezzlement and fraud that had been carefully concealed through fake consulting contracts and manipulated expense reporting over several years. Hassan's lifestyle had been subsidized by systematic theft from his own company, the expensive suits and Hampton weekends funded through elaborately disguised financial crimes that could result in federal prosecution. The evidence Maria provided included bank records, fabricated invoices, and email communications that revealed the full scope of Hassan's criminal activity, transforming what had begun as a discrimination case into a major white-collar crime investigation. Sterling's forensic accountants confirmed Maria's allegations within days, their analysis revealing approximately $2 million in fraudulent transactions that Hassan had concealed through sophisticated financial manipulation and false documentation. The discovery shifted the entire dynamic of their confrontation. Hassan's character assassination campaign suddenly seemed like desperate misdirection rather than legitimate concern about Layla's credibility and motivations. "This changes everything," Sterling acknowledged during their follow-up meeting, his tone reflecting both relief at vindication and concern about his organization's potential liability for their business relationship with a criminal enterprise. The federal investigation that followed Maria's whistleblower complaint moved with surprising speed, FBI financial crime specialists recognizing patterns that suggested Hassan's embezzlement was part of a larger network of corporate fraud that extended beyond Zenith Technologies. His panic became increasingly evident as investigators seized financial records and froze assets, his earlier confidence replaced by the desperate behavior of someone who realized that his criminal activities were being exposed to authorities with the resources to pursue serious consequences. The transformation from powerful executive to cornered criminal was stark, his professional reputation dissolving as former colleagues and clients distanced themselves from association with potential criminal liability. Layla found herself in the strange position of watching her tormentor's destruction from a safe distance, the corporate protection that Sterling's organization provided allowing her to observe Hassan's downfall without direct involvement in the criminal proceedings. His attempts to implicate her in his financial crimes were quickly dismissed by investigators who recognized desperate deflection when they encountered it, while her cooperation with the federal investigation enhanced her credibility rather than undermining it. The justice she'd sought for personal humiliation had uncovered systematic criminality that would protect future victims from Hassan's predatory behavior. The media attention that followed Hassan's arrest was extensive but carefully managed, Sterling's PR team ensuring that coverage focused on corporate fraud and financial crimes rather than the personal discrimination that had initiated the investigation. Layla's role was characterized as that of a concerned consultant who had identified patterns of unethical behavior, her background and motivations protected from the kind of scrutiny that Hassan had attempted to encourage. The narrative that emerged painted her as someone whose cultural competency, expertise, had revealed problems that might otherwise have remained hidden, transforming her from victim to hero in a story about corporate accountability and justice. Hassan's legal team's final desperate strategy involved attempting to plea bargain using information about other corporate executives engaged in similar financial crimes. But his credibility had been so thoroughly destroyed that prosecutors showed little interest in deals that might allow him to avoid significant prison time. His systematic character assassination campaign had backfired completely, the evidence of his vindictive behavior toward Layla actually strengthening the prosecution's case about his lack of moral character and tendency toward retaliation against anyone who threatened his criminal enterprise. The man who had casually destroyed others through prejudice and cruelty was now experiencing the full weight of institutional justice applied with surgical precision. The final irony came when Hassan's assets were frozen pending restitution proceedings, forcing him to rely on public defenders rather than the expensive legal team that had initiated his counterattack against Layla's reputation. His expensive lifestyle evaporated overnight. The suits and accessories that had symbolized his superiority revealed as stolen property that would be liquidated to compensate his victims. The transformation was so complete that former colleagues struggled to reconcile the confident executive they'd known with the desperate criminal now facing decades in federal prison for his elaborate schemes and vindictive behavior. The Zenith Technologies boardroom felt like a tomb as Hassan entered what would be his final meeting as an executive. The familiar conference table now surrounded by faces that regarded him with the cold assessment of people calculating legal liability and reputational damage. His usual confident stride had been replaced by the careful steps of someone who knew that every word and gesture would be scrutinized for evidence of guilt or manipulation, while his expensive suit seemed almost costume-like now that everyone understood how his lifestyle had been funded through systematic theft and fraud. The morning sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows illuminated a scene of corporate justice that would determine not just Hassan's fate, but the future direction of an organization that had enabled his behavior for too many years. Layla sat at the far end of the conference table as the key witness whose testimony would seal Hassan's professional destruction, her presence transforming the routine board meeting into a tribunal where years of discrimination and financial crimes would finally face appropriate consequences. She'd prepared her presentation with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized her restaurant service, but now those skills were deployed in service of justice rather than customer satisfaction. The tablet in front of her contained comprehensive documentation that would systematically dismantle Hassan's credibility while establishing patterns of behavior that extended far beyond their initial restaurant encounter. Board Chairman Robert Chen called the meeting to order with the gravitas appropriate to proceedings that would likely result in criminal referrals and civil lawsuits, his tone reflecting the seriousness of allegations that threatened the company's survival and reputation. "We're here to address allegations of discriminatory behavior and financial impropriety that have come to light regarding Hassan al-Rashid's conduct as Vice President of Operations," he announced, his words carrying the weight of legal proceedings that had moved far beyond internal disciplinary measures. "These are serious charges that require thorough examination and appropriate response to protect our organization and stakeholders." Hassan's attorney had advised him to remain silent during the presentation of evidence, but his body language revealed the strain of maintaining composure while listening to the systematic demolition of his character and career. Layla's testimony began with the restaurant incident, but quickly expanded to include patterns of workplace discrimination that Maria Santos had documented over several years of employment as Hassan's assistant. The evidence was overwhelming in its scope and specificity. Recorded conversations where Hassan made explicitly prejudiced statements about employees and clients. Email correspondence revealing systematic bias in hiring and promotion decisions. Meeting notes capturing casual cruelty toward anyone he perceived as culturally or socially inferior. Mr. al-Rashid's comments at Meridian Bistro were not isolated incidents, but part of a consistent pattern of discriminatory behavior that created hostile work environments and potential legal liability for this organization, Layla explained, her voice steady as she presented evidence that revealed the full scope of Hassan's prejudices. The board members' expressions grew increasingly grave as they recognized the extent of their potential exposure to discrimination lawsuits and regulatory sanctions, while Hassan's face remained carefully neutral despite the obvious strain of hearing his private thoughts and conversations exposed to institutional scrutiny and judgment. The financial evidence presented by Sterling Ventures' forensic accountants was even more damning than the discrimination charges, revealing approximately $2 million in fraudulent transactions that Hassan had concealed through fake consulting contracts and manipulated expense reporting over a 3-year period. Bank records showed systematic transfers to personal accounts disguised as legitimate business expenses, while fabricated invoices documented payments to shell companies that existed only to launder Hassan's stolen funds. The sophistication of his embezzlement scheme demonstrated planning and intent that would support serious criminal charges, while the duration of his activities suggested a level of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Dr. Amira Hassan, a board member and Arabic language professor at Columbia University, provided independent verification of the restaurant recordings that formed the foundation of the discrimination charges. Her translation of Hassan's statements was even more damning than Layla's initial version, capturing cultural nuances and implied meanings that revealed the depth of his prejudicial thinking. These comments reflect not just personal bias, but systematic dehumanization that would be extremely damaging to our company's reputation and business relationships, she explained, her academic credentials lending additional weight to testimony that destroyed any remaining doubt about Hassan's character and judgment. The board's decision was swift and unanimous. Hassan's termination for cause, immediate suspension of all company benefits and access, and full cooperation with federal investigators pursuing criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud. The vote was conducted with the clinical efficiency of people who understood that their primary obligation was protecting the organization from further damage rather than considering Hassan's personal circumstances or potential for rehabilitation. His years of service and previous contributions were rendered irrelevant by evidence that revealed systematic criminality and discriminatory behavior that violated both legal requirements and ethical standards. Hassan's final statement to the board was a masterpiece of deflection and denial. His attempts to characterize the evidence as misinterpretation and personal vendetta falling flat in the face of overwhelming documentation and independent corroboration. This is a coordinated attack by disgruntled employees and opportunistic consultants who are seeking to profit from false accusations, he claimed, his voice lacking conviction as he delivered words that convinced no one present. The contrast between his earlier confidence and current desperation was stark. The powerful executive who had casually destroyed others through prejudice, now reduced to pleading for consideration he had never shown to his own victims. The media statement released following Hassan's termination was carefully crafted to emphasize Zenith Technologies' commitment to diversity, inclusion, and ethical business practices while acknowledging their failure to identify and address problematic behavior that had persisted for years. The company's stock price suffered immediate impact from news of the criminal investigation and discrimination charges, while several major clients announced reviews of their contracts pending resolution of the criminal proceedings. Hassan's individual crimes had become institutional liability that threatened the survival of an organization that had enabled his behavior through inadequate oversight and cultural tolerance for casual prejudice. Sterling Ventures announced the immediate termination of all contracts with Zenith Technologies, their statement emphasizing that business relationships require shared values and ethical standards that cannot be compromised for financial considerations. Marcus Sterling's personal comment to the media praised Layla's courage in speaking out against discrimination and her valuable insights into cultural competency that would inform future business decisions. Ms. Ahmed's expertise and integrity exemplify the kind of partnership we value, he stated. While this situation demonstrates why due diligence must include careful assessment of character and values, not just technical capabilities, the federal prosecutors who announced Hassan's indictment on multiple counts of embezzlement, fraud, and tax evasion emphasized that white-collar crime investigations often revealed patterns of unethical behavior that extended beyond financial crimes to include discrimination and abuse of power. Their press conference highlighted the importance of whistleblowers like Maria Santos and cultural competency experts like Layla Ahmed in identifying problems that traditional oversight mechanisms had missed. Hassan's bail was set at $500,000, an amount that his frozen assets made difficult to obtain, while prosecutors indicated their intention to seek maximum penalties given the scope and duration of his criminal activities. The transformation from powerful executive to criminal defendant was complete. Hassan's mugshot replacing the confident professional headshot that had adorned Zenith's website and corporate materials for years. Former colleagues and clients distanced themselves with statements emphasizing their shock at revelations that contradicted their previous impressions, while industry publications analyzed how systematic fraud and discrimination had been concealed within a respected consulting firm. The man who had casually dismissed Layla's worth and intelligence was now facing decades in federal prison, his downfall serving as a cautionary tale about the eventual consequences of unchecked privilege and prejudice. 6 months later, Layla Ahmed walked through the gleaming lobby of Sterling Ventures as their newly appointed Director of Cultural Competency and Ethical Business Practices, her heels clicking against marble floors that had once intimidated her, but now felt like home territory. The corporate consulting role represented more than professional advancement. It was vindication of capabilities that had been systematically undervalued and dismissed by people who confused servitude with stupidity. Her corner office overlooked the same Manhattan skyline she'd viewed from restaurant windows while clearing other people's plates. But the perspective was entirely different now, transformed from observer to participant in conversations that shaped business relationships worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The work itself proved more satisfying than she'd anticipated, combining academic knowledge with real-world insights gained from years of observing human behavior in service roles where people revealed their true characters. Her days were filled with evaluating potential business partners, training executives on cultural sensitivity, and developing policies that would prevent the kind of systematic discrimination that had flourished under Hassan's leadership at Zenith Technologies. The restaurant experience had taught her to read subtle signals of prejudice and entitlement that more traditional backgrounds might miss, skills that proved invaluable when assessing corporate cultures and individual character during due diligence processes. Hassan al-Rashid's criminal trial had concluded 3 weeks earlier with convictions on all counts, the jury requiring only 4 hours of deliberation to find him guilty of embezzlement, fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy charges that would keep him in federal prison for the next 12 to 15 years. His sentencing hearing had been attended by several of his victims, including Maria Santos, whose whistleblower testimony had been crucial in securing convictions that might otherwise have been difficult to obtain. The judge's comments during sentencing emphasized the systematic nature of Hassan's crimes and their impact on individuals who had trusted him with their careers and financial security. Zenith Technologies had filed for bankruptcy protection within a month of Hassan's indictment. The combination of criminal investigation, client defections, and civil lawsuits proving too devastating for the firm to survive. The company's assets were being liquidated to pay restitution to embezzlement victims and settlement funds for discrimination lawsuits that had emerged once Hassan's pattern of behavior became public knowledge. Several former employees had come forward with stories of workplace harassment and cultural insensitivity that painted a picture of institutional toxicity that had extended far beyond Hassan's individual actions, though his leadership role had clearly enabled and encouraged such behavior. Layla's role at Sterling Ventures had evolved beyond consulting into active partnership in investment decisions, her cultural competency analysis becoming a standard component of due diligence processes for all potential business relationships. The value of her insights had been demonstrated through several avoided partnerships where her assessment revealed character issues or cultural blind spots that would have created future problems. Your ability to identify red flags that traditional vetting processes miss has already saved us millions in potential liability and reputational damage, Marcus Sterling had told her during her recent performance review, his tone reflecting genuine appreciation rather than the patronizing approval she'd grown accustomed to receiving in service roles. The speaking engagement requests had surprised her initially, but she'd discovered a talent for translating complex cultural dynamics into practical business guidance that resonated with executives seeking to avoid Hassan-style disasters. Her presentations at industry conferences drew standing ovations from audiences who recognized the value of perspectives that traditional business education often overlooked, while her consulting work with other firms had generated waiting lists that extended months into the future. The demand for genuine cultural competency expertise had exploded as companies recognized that diversity and inclusion were business necessities rather than compliance requirements. Her personal transformation was perhaps more profound than her professional success. The confidence that came from having her expertise valued and respected, replacing years of defensive self-protection that service work had required. The woman who had absorbed Hassan's casual cruelty while maintaining professional composure had been replaced by someone who commanded attention and respect in corporate boardrooms where decisions affecting thousands of employees and millions of dollars were made daily. The difference wasn't just in external circumstances, but in internal conviction. She now understood her own worth in ways that no amount of academic achievement or professional success could have taught her, without the contrast of having that worth questioned and dismissed. The lunch invitation from Meridian Bistro's owner had been unexpected but meaningful. His request that she return as a special guest rather than an employee, serving a symbolic closure to a chapter of her life that had ended with Hassan's conviction and imprisonment. Walking into the restaurant where her transformation had begun felt surreal, the elegant dining room now seeming smaller and less intimidating than she remembered from her serving days. The staff who remembered her greeted her with genuine warmth and pride, their reactions reflecting the inspiration that her story provided to others who faced similar challenges and discrimination in their daily work. Her former name tag from Meridian Bistro now hung framed in her Sterling Ventures office, a reminder of lessons learned during months when her capabilities were invisible to everyone around her, except herself. The simple plastic rectangle with Layla, printed in basic font, served as a powerful symbol of hidden potential and the dangers of assuming that someone's current circumstances reflected their ultimate capabilities or worth. Visitors to her office often asked about the unusual decoration, providing opportunities to share insights about unconscious bias and the importance of recognizing talent, regardless of its packaging or presentation. The final phase of her transformation involved training corporate executives on cultural competency and recognizing discriminatory behavior before it created legal liability or damaged business relationships. Her workshops drew on Hassan's case as a cautionary tale about how personal prejudices could destroy careers and organizations when left unchecked by appropriate oversight and accountability measures. The irony that Hassan's cruelty had ultimately created opportunities for positive change wasn't lost on her, though she preferred focusing on prevention rather than punishment when discussing these issues with business leaders seeking to improve their organizational cultures. The letter from Hassan's prison had arrived the previous week, a rambling attempt at apology that seemed motivated more by self-pity than genuine remorse for the damage he'd caused to numerous victims over years of discriminatory behavior and financial crimes. She'd read it once before filing it away without response, recognizing that closure came from moving forward rather than rehashing the past with someone who still didn't understand the full scope of his actions and their consequences. Her energy was better invested in preventing future Hassan al-Rashids from achieving positions where they could damage other people's lives and careers through unchecked privilege and prejudice. The view from her office window showed the same Manhattan skyline she'd admired during restaurant breaks, but everything had changed about her relationship to that landscape and her place within it. She was no longer an observer watching other people's success from the sidelines, but an active participant in shaping business practices that would create more equitable opportunities for people whose talents had been overlooked or dismissed. The woman who had once served Hassan's lunch now had the power to ensure that his pattern of behavior would never again be tolerated in organizations that valued integrity and inclusion over privilege and prejudice. The end. If this story resonated with you, comment below and share where you're reading from. Your engagement helps stories like this reach others who need to see that justice is possible, even when it takes time and courage to achieve.